Okay, so I'm going to go through some quick accessibility information. Captions are available in Zoom. You can navigate to the bottom of your little toolbar at the bottom and click Show Subtitle or Show Captions to turn them on. They are also running, I believe, at captionviewer.net. So, Cart, would you be able to paste that link in the chat for people to access? Perfect. So anyone who would like to view captions at an external site, you can go ahead and use the link in the chat. We also have ASL interpreters available today. We're presenting in gallery view, so the interpreters should always be visible. You don't need to pin them. And please know that we do have two interpreters. So if you pin the current interpreter, it could prevent you from seeing the active interpreter after an interpreter change. You do not need to be on Zoom to access this event. We will read all of the questions out loud and voice images on the screen. So content will be available to images calling in or to individuals calling in or to anyone who can't see visual content. The event is being recorded and will be published to the Disability Empowerment Center's YouTube channel in, I would say, roughly a week. And so we will answer any questions that our audience might have towards the end. And as we go on, we will use both person with a disability and disabled person interchangeably, recognizing different people's preferences for person first or identity first language. And so with that, hello everyone, and welcome to our Understanding Ableism webinar series hosted by the King County Disability Consortium and the Disability Empowerment Center. My name is Sarah Marshall. My pronouns are she, her, and I am an AmeriCorps member serving at the Disability Empowerment Center as the King County Disability Consortium Coordinator. I am a young white woman with short brown hair. I'm wearing a pair of gray headphones. And I have a black top and jacket today, and I will be working in an office, but my background is blurred. And so I would like to kick off our webinar by giving a definition from disability researcher Ian Langtree, who defines ableism as a complex system of beliefs, practices, and institutional structures that position disability as inherently negative while simultaneously privileging non-disabled bodies and minds as the standard against which all others are measured. And so with this definition in mind, the Understanding Ableism series was created to explore how ableism shows up in our policies, communities, and everyday interactions. Each session brings together community members and advocates to share lived experience and practical knowledge with the hope of helping us all move towards a more inclusive and accessible King County. And to give a little background on the King County Disability Consortium, it began during the COVID-19 pandemic as a way to connect disability-serving organizations and community members during a time of widespread isolation and uncertainty. Many people with disabilities face disproportionate barriers, from healthcare access to transportation to digital communication and even just basic safety. And so KCDC was built to share information and elevate lived experiences to respond to the needs of our disability community. And so for our third session of the 2026 Understanding Ableism series, we're going to dive into models of disability, looking specifically at 6 models of disability to help understand and discuss how different frameworks shape how disability is viewed and can be addressed in society. And so each of our panelists are going to speak about the models and share their understandings, experiences, and insights. And so with that, I'm going to have our lovely panelists introduce themselves. And we can start with Lydia.
Hi, I'm Lydia McDermott, and I am a professor in Walla Walla, Washington, on the other side of the mountains. and I teach in rhetoric, in writing and gender studies and disability studies. Um, I use she, her pronouns, and I am wearing glasses. I have chin length, dark hair, kind of messy looking. And I'm in my home because it's spring break at our college right now. Thank you.
Philip, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Looking for there I am. I'm Philip Bradford. I'm an independent living specialist at the Disability Empowerment Center based out of our Seattle office. I am an older adult male with from top to bottom retro mod uh, sandy hair. I'm wearing a Disability Empowerment Center t-shirt with a hoodie over it and jeans and Doc Martens. I go by he, him pronouns.
Great. All right. So go ahead and move into our first slide. Here we go. So I think it's very important to understand what a model is before we dive in to look at specific models of disability. And so for the purposes of this webinar, I think it's important to define a model as essentially a framework or a lens that helps us understand something complex. It's a way of organizing ideas about how something works, what causes it, and how we should respond to it. Models are not perfect representations of reality. Rather, they highlight certain aspects of an issue while sometimes leaving others out. And so, because of that, different models can leave people to interpret the same experience in different ways. And so, when we talk about models of disability, we're talking about the different ways societies, institutions, and individuals understand disability, and whether that's what they believe causes it, what they see as the problem, or what they think the appropriate response should be. And so, thinking about this more broadly, the model that someone uses can shape anything from public policy to healthcare decisions to everyday interactions and attitudes towards people with disabilities. So as we move through these models today, it's important to remember that they're tools for understanding. And while many of them overlap, people may encounter multiple models at the same time, depending on the context. And so with the text on the screen, I've just included some definitions and kind of some overview of what the models are, some of their characterizations, and how they work to address perceived causes of disability, what they argue is the appropriate response, and how they explore deeper meanings. And so in the interest of time, I'm not going to read through everything that's on screen, but I will reiterate that these slides and the webinar itself will be published to our YouTube channel if anyone has interest in going back later to review them. So we'll move to our first model, which is one of the most widely recognized ways disability has been understood historically. And this is going to be the medical model. And so in this model, disability is primarily understood as a problem, which is located within an individual's body or mind. And so the focus in this model is on the impairment itself. And the response is often to cure, to treat, or to manage that condition through medical intervention. Doctors and other professionals are typically positioned as the experts, and success is often measured by how closely someone can return to a non-disabled norm. And I would like to say that medical care is absolutely important. It can provide diagnoses, treatments, and access to assistive technology. But as a caveat, when this model dominates, it can place responsibility on the individuals rather than addressing barriers in the environment. So I would love our panelists to build on this however they see fit. So we can start with Lydia and then we'll move to Philip.
I was not unmuted. Sorry about that. Um, so I think this is a good overview of the medical model, and something that I think is really important to understand is that impairments affect our lives in tangible ways, and the medical model does address that. Um, I would also mention that I don't think most people, even doctors, are necessarily working under the assumption that they are participating in a specific model. It just tends to dominate the way that they see things. So, the medical model prioritizes healing, and uh, fixing fixing problems, right? A disability is a problem to be solved. Um, and I think one of the ways that we can think of this as both positive and negative is if you've had any experience trying to get accommodations for a work or school experience, either through the ADA or 504, where it is very important to have documentation of a diagnosis in order to get those accommodations, which you have a right to, but you have to prove your impairment in order to receive. So this, on the one hand, is good because it means that we can get those accommodations. On the other hand, it's very limiting because not everyone can afford to be diagnosed many times. Not every impairment that a person with a disability may have would be considered a disability necessarily. Right. So the other thing that gets lost sometimes in the medical model are chronic conditions that are not always considered, even in the disability community, are not always considered to be a part of that community. But the medical model, because it is so determined to fix and cure, has a very hard time dealing with chronic conditions that can't be pinned down and treated easily. I think it's a very important model to understand for our experience because it is so dominant. So all of us are interacting with healthcare systems repeatedly. And one of the, I think, the most negative outcomes of the medical model for me, maybe on a personal level and for others, is that the doctor is the expert. And I'm sure some of you have had this experience, and I have, where you are explaining things that you know about your own body to a doctor who seems to feel that they know more than you do about your body. And so they may write off what you have to say. So it can lead to, trying to find other doctors, um, and and can be a very frustrating and demoralizing experience. So it can really fall short in that way. Um, and I will open it up to Philip now.
Okay. Sarah, thank you very much for starting us off with a richly subjective view of what these models are. Um, they're, of course, described academically, professionally, but ultimately, this is an experience that those of us who are affected by these models or use them to describe ourselves and our experience have to go on. I um, have, I guess, the advantage of having lived and worked through decades of the medical model being the primary and early on, nearly the only model evident to me um, to point me in a direction where the professionals thought I should go. This has a two-edged advantage on it. I, to this day, don't like being thought of as a diagnosis and have avoided, whenever possible, formal diagnostic environments. I can tell you that in public school, it was beneficial in helping my information processing barriers to inclusion in my community get pointed into the arts and into areas where I could learn in a non-typical manner and express myself. And it led to what is still a very fulfilling life. The medical model is still alive in my community, and I try to be friends with my friends who are practitioners. I have someone that I'm currently supporting who is a medical professional who is also neurodivergent, and this is a case where we're getting more and more empathy in cross disciplines with the realization that we are not our diagnosis. So I concur that the medical model is invaluable in lowering trauma through the services that it can provide. It has the advantage of helping find the self-definition or the self-realization of I'm not broken. I have a disability or disabilities that have caused me to function in certain ways, and I don't have any need to fix that. But knowing that there's a cause and effect, that if there's a diagnosed cause to something, that it can lead to some solutions that, in my case, are um, not medicinal. And I love the fact that I have choices. That's why, looking at this model, I still think of the independent living model at the same time, and I prefer to continue to explore with support um, alternatives to fixing when I have people who are knowledgeable in the medical field and understand that this is a an industry. It's a successful industry at this point, and helping my peers to utilize this for our benefit rather than just turning over the results to a medical professional. I've been familiar with this since I ran into folks a couple of decades ago who, realizing what was going on, and started identifying themselves as people first. And while I still maintain my disability pride, I am a person with a disability, and I feel like I have tools to improve my quality of life when I know uh, where that road needs to go. Thanks.
Thank you to the both of you for your wonderful explanations and reflections. I think it really speaks to the nuance of the models themselves and why it's important to not look at them objectively, Philip, as you said. And so we'll transition to our next model. So as disability advocacy evolved, many disability activists began challenging the idea that disability exists only within an individual body. And so that shift led to the development of the social model, which takes a very different perspective. So the social model shifts the focus away from individual bodies toward the barriers created by society. And in this framework, disability occurs when environments, systems, or attitudes fail to accommodate human differences. An example of this, an issue isn't that someone uses a wheelchair. The issue is a building without a ramp. The issue isn't that someone is deaf. The issue is the absence of interpreters or captions in everyday spaces. And these examples go on and on. There's so many instances where barriers are very obvious to people with disabilities and less so to people who don't need the same sort of accommodations. But because they're framed as accommodations and aren't incorporated directly in the environment, they're not always recognized in policies or infrastructure. And so some people point out that while it is very helpful to illuminate disability rights advocacy and accessibility policies, it can also sometimes overlook the real bodily experiences of disability, like pain or fatigue. Lydia earlier mentioned chronic pain, chronic conditions. And so I think that also kind of remains true for the social model as well. And so I'll turn back to our panelists here. So I'd be curious to know their thoughts on the social model.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks for bringing up the issue of chronic pain or fatigue uh, and the ways in which the social model may not always be helpful for that either. I think that the social model is usually the one that, if people are familiar with models of disability, it's usually the medical model and the social model. And that shift of perspective from the individual to the social model can be really freeing to realize that the environment and society, culture, everything built around you is assuming a very particular body and mind that does not include those of us with disabilities. Right? The easiest way to see that is in built environments, like if you are a wheelchair user, the fact that curb cuts or that curbs exist, right? That no one was thinking of that when they built that first curb, right? Or as an educator, I think a lot about universal design for learning and the assumptions within education that perpetuate an idea that there is one good way to learn. So the shift in thinking is to realize that it's not that disability is located within me. It's that I have an impairment and the society and built environment around me disables me, makes it difficult for me to exist or exist freely and fully. And I agree, though, where it does fall short is the idea that sometimes if you're so focused on the social model and disability as a social construct, you might ignore the very real felt effects of disability for people, right? Knowing that knowing that the world is not built for my body does not make my chronic pain go away, right? So this is where the social model is helpful in readjusting our focus and in trying to make a more inclusive society. Um, but but it highlights where the medical model might also be necessary, right? Yeah, I do think though that can be a really revelatory thing to realize that there's not that perhaps there's something wrong with society instead of with you. Um, the other thing that a social model allows for that a medical model may not allow for is uh, is an acceptance of an identity as disabled, right? So if you think about the rise of advocacy for neurodivergence, right? Um, if we're in a medical model, then we want to seek cures. From a social model, we can say that neurodivergence is a natural way of being in the world that our society is not accommodating. And so we can choose to accept that, right? Or choose to accept um, any any different kinds of disabilities that from a medical model you should be seeking to cure. That would be the correct path forward in a medical model. A social model allows you to say, no, I think society needs to change. Um, and I'll leave it there for right now.
Um, Big fan, and I spend a lot of both professional and personal time thinking about the social model to the point of I think the medical model needs to be retooled and universally designed to accommodate people rather than priorities which it may have now. And I will leave that to your thoughts. I'm a proponent and practice within my peer support the social model. Uh, the core service of systemic advocacy is part of really as much of my work as I can fit in when I'm not helping support people one-on-one with their own personal goals. I am disabled. I am not my disability to be used for the purposes of people other than myself and my direct peers. So when we do design with disabled folks in mind, nothing about us without us really has to include us. I can give an example in my own neighborhood. Having broken my leg when my motorcycle fell on it last summer, I needed to be in a manual wheelchair for about 6 weeks. And I found out that the curb cuts that had been designed were not designed with somebody with the upper body strength, which I had not kept in development up to that time. I didn't feel like I needed to uh, take a running start and hoist myself. And, I'm reasonably strong. But that to me challenged my impressions of how thoroughly these designs are put in place with enough people, not just one focus group. There is a park going into place across the street from my building They're just beginning the design of it. The heavy equipment to start tearing down the old structure just came on site this week. Next Thursday, there is yet another hearing at my building that I intend to be at to address one last time the degree of lift in a circuitous path going from the bottom to the top of this park, and whether or not it's sufficiently flat and graduated enough to accommodate everybody who would like to enjoy this brand new park that is surrounding a brand new reservoir in our neighborhood. So these things have direct physical benefits. Again, my disability is primarily information processing and how I take that and communicate. So uh, having closed caption, having cart, and having Sarah spend time setting all these things up. So all of us feel like we can be included, and I'm hoping everybody listening out there feels like they're accessing this information. It's essential. Um, my primary connection probably with my stepdaughter is that she is a commercial designer who fervently believes in universal design. That's our that's our spiritual connection. Um, we're not going to be able to rest on this. I'm told that the Roman Colosseum is accessible, that they have thought this out, and that someone in a wheelchair can absolutely go from bottom to top. Haven't been to Rome, it's on my list, but I'm looking forward to seeing this result in action. I love old architecture. I love some of the old brownstones and the 100-year-old buildings in Seattle, and I would like to see all of them be useful in business, as residences, and just as great historical fixtures, but accessible. Thank you.
Thank you both for your reflections. I find that it is very true that it's hard to conceptualize an environment without thinking about the people who constructed it. And so I think it speaks to the nature of disability, that it continues to complicate and interrogate what those spaces can look like when people are included. So we'll move on to our next model, which is a moral and religious model. And while the social model emerged from more modern disability activism, other ways of understanding disability have existed for much longer. So one of the oldest is this sort of moral religious model. Though culturally and personally it can vary differently, it could be interpreted as some sort of like disability as a punishment or a test of faith. Sometimes it's framed as a spiritual lesson. Sometimes it's even framed as a blessing. And people respond to it in very different ways, whether that's in their own religious or spiritual practices, the belief that having a disability is part of a larger spiritual plan. And for some people, these perspectives do provide meaning and community and support, but they can also lead to harmful assumptions and are very easily internalized, where you begin blaming individuals or families for a disability, treating disabled people as symbols rather than as full individuals. And I will say, since this is not confined to a particular religion or culture, and is very varied. There's not a particular mode or practice that this model represents. It's more just a larger understanding of where this comes up and how spiritually or morally you yourself are interpreting disability, or people in your life or community interpret disability. And so with that, I'd love to invite our panelists to reflect on this model.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah. I think that I also just want to say back real quick to Philip that I love that your spiritual connection with your stepdaughter is about universal design. That's a lovely segue into talking about this model. And if only everyone understood that universal design is universal. So if you're considering so many different body types and mind types, you actually benefit everyone. But to get to the moral and religious model, this is probably the oldest model, and we can see it in ancient Greek texts and medieval books of wonder that, or books of monstrosity, right? These disabilities were cast as either blessings, special, like an oracle from God, or a punishment for a communal sin or for an individual sin. And though I don't think most cultures believe exactly that within their religions anymore, I do think that there are a lot of harmful parts of this kind of model that we still perpetuate in a variety of places. I'll share one personal example and then one that is a little less religious, but still talks about the moral part of this. I had a very good friend when I was younger, who had rheumatoid arthritis and participated in a kind of camp revival religious ceremony where there was a healer at the front. And she was not healed, and was really led to believe that it was because she was not faithful enough. And I think that that's abusive to her. Um, so that kind of idea that you have to be good enough to be cured is really painful and unfair. Not that people can't seek spiritual solace for any kinds of difficulties, but that idea that you earn it is really detrimental to one's self-worth. And where I still see that, even outside of any kind of religious model, is in the proliferation of media that features the like the person with a disability who overcomes against all odds and succeeds. Um, and they're made out to be kind of a hero because they persevered against everything. Um, and therefore, right, everybody with a disability should be able to do that. Or maybe they aren't trying hard enough. So that's where that becomes really, really harmful. I honestly have a hard time finding positive aspects of this model. Not that I don't find positive aspects to religion or spirituality, but this model tends to equate moral goodness with health. We even see that in just, this is a really weird example, but I went in for a colonoscopy before I turned 50, which is when like everyone recommends you go. And the people who were prepping me for my colonoscopy were congratulating me on being so proactive with my health, as if it was um, a moral strength of mine. I'm a very good person because I went in and got a colonoscopy early. We make moral judgments of folks who have um, other kinds of physical limitations, whether or not we think people are being healthy enough. My Many members of my family have type 2 diabetes. This is one that gets a lot of moral judgment. And I think that that is um, very harmful to individuals and to our society in general because it doesn't lead to inclusivity or progress in any way. Um, so I guess, yeah, I don't like it. I'm sorry. Um, I'll leave it at that.
Lydia, I want to thank you very much for finding a place to insert inspiration in this conversation. I hadn't thought of that in that way, and I totally concur. There are moral judgment roots in deciding whether someone is asserting themselves and attempting to succeed and and really projecting their success in terms of ways that other people can judge it, like everything is the Olympics. That bores me. I have managed to check off a lot of boxes, bucket lists, and really astride from being judged. Uh, I'm having a cool life, but there have been times when I have really felt like I had to duck and cover from community judgments, from the judgments of people one-on-one who may have enjoyed my participation in something, but had they known about my disability, something else would have kicked in. This happened in an area, uh, a special interest, because, those of us who are neurodivergent always have special interests. Well, I do. Um, I was a monthly columnist for a drag racing magazine for a while, and a professional in that sport, after several years, paused and said, Phil, you're really an inspiration. And at that point, it was like some of my work, and I thought it was pretty good scene reporting, just didn't feel valued. Um, I want to move on to the religious model. I have seen and heard secondhand some positives about faith communities who have appreciated the um, fellowship, I guess you can call it, and participation of disabled folks that they knew were disabled, and and allowed for secretarial admin roles, allowed for full participation in rituals, um, allowed for direct service providers to be on site and help to facilitate this participation without those people expected to take over or this just be performative. Um, and in my life, I really don't feel like I've had that, but I know that it's out there. I am one of those folks who, whether there are two or more in the room, feel like there's a presence. And spiritual practices are important for my emotional and physical health as well. So I do them. Mostly I do them pragmatically. To have a big eminence in the sky, deciding that I am any less than anyone else because of a disability is preposterous to me. So I kind of have to pay selective attention when people imply that and move on. And just like with some of these other models, when I run into those barriers of people not accepting and willing to include me, rejecting equity, I go around them and I look for something else, and I continue to find interesting alternatives to that. So, yeah, some pretty horrible things, eugenics, which apparently has roots in this country and spread to Europe 100 years ago. There are still negative influences around, and to be supportive of my community, letting them know that there are alternatives. I can help you look for clues that you can chase on your own. But there is both visible and invisible support out there. Uh, but letting a model of disability define my morality is it's ugly. I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you both for your thoughts. I think, yeah, there's not a lot of great aspects to this model, but I will say something that is useful about it, I think, is the fact that recognizing it, acknowledging it, helps at least take the first step in moving away from it. If you're kind of just absorbing these sort of sentiments unconsciously, it's it's definitely not as helpful as being able to recognize them and reframe them in ways that are more personally beneficial to you. So we'll transition to our next model, which is the charity model of disability. Um, this is a framework that we still encounter today, particularly in media and fundraising, where disabled people are portrayed as individuals who need help. And the solution is charitable giving or assistance from others. You might see this in fundraising campaigns or stories that portray disabled people as tragic or, like we were talking about earlier, inspirational figures. And while this is very helpful for funding services that directly benefit these people, it can also be really negative in reinforcing stereotypes that people with disabilities are helpless or dependent upon the charity of others. The other issue with this is that it often tends to center non-disabled helpers rather than disabled leadership. And so I would love to hear from our panelists about what they think about this model.
Hi again. So yeah, the charity model often comes out of a moral or religious model as well. And I would say first that there's nothing wrong with giving to people. That's lovely. Um, but I think that one of the things that the charity model perpetuates is the idea that people with disabilities cannot live full lives. They are reduced to the disability, um, and are victims of that disability and need to be saved by someone. And so that's where the charity model can become an avenue for able-bodied, able-minded folk to feel good about themselves because they're helping out some victims, which is really detrimental to the whole community of people with disabilities. Even though, unfortunately, it raises money often for good things, right? So that's the paradox there, is that maybe there is good coming out of it, but the the assumptions that it perpetuates, I think, are more harmful. Because, of course, we are not just our disabilities and we do live full lives. And it is not a paradox to be happy and full and also have a disability. And this kind of model rests on the idea that that is impossible. Um, so yeah, the other thing I would mention that I think is a really interesting bit of trivia is that the word handicap literally comes from the idea of having cap in hand to beg, because you are not a productive member of society as someone with a disability and you must beg for charity. I'm not advocating that. I'm saying that's what the assumption is um, behind that word, which is one of the reasons a lot of folks don't like that word, and behind the charity model itself. Again, it looks for inspiration the same way that that religious and moral model does, but often to benefit those who are not dealing with disabilities, who don't have disabilities. Um, so yeah, I think this is another one that is often comes from good intentions, but is really harmful. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Lydia. I tend to want to get down to the core of why there there is charity in the first place, why it's so prevalent, why it apparently generates uh, money. You can't escape charitable solicitations on late night television. I worked for um, in the past nonprofits that have uh, relied on donors who were educated in the charity model and educating more to uh, self-determination and disabled folks wanting to chart their own course, simply needing accommodations, supports. Um, the old saying, a hand up, not a handout. Yeah, I'm not exactly comfortable with that either, but I think it makes the case to uh, giving people a very individual set of possibilities is the best use of some of these organizations that can be awfully dependent on inspiration to raise funds. I was a job developer on a crew of folks who took about maybe as much as 2 years for us to all finally share that yes, we all had disabilities. I practiced my work during that time from a peer standpoint. Uh, I was not hired as a disabled job developer. I was a disabled job developer who had the same disability connections with people I was supporting, so it made communication easier. And I could possibly treat folks in a way that lessens them. I do what I could to try to utilize services that were available. And I've taken that as, okay, excuse me, folks, because I'm using my pattern recognition skills. It's common to neurodivergent people, linking the moral, religious, the charity model, and we're coming up on the human rights model shortly, so bear with me. vocation is not the same as job. Vocation is practicing uh, and moving towards the path of what you're meant to do, of what inspires you, not is an inspiration to other people so much. And when we can feel validated in pursuing our path and getting some material resources to do it, this model can, I guess, be manipulated slightly and be used. I'm proud of my 501 work because it's had mutual aid inserted into it instead of charity from the outside. Some resources added into a mix of people mutually deciding what they need, and together as a community, we peers, uh, finding the resources, turning over rocks where we have to, but then getting our needs met that way. And to me, that's that's the alternative to the charity model. It's more mutual aid. It's independent living with uh, supports identified and resources referred to give us all a great life. And I do believe that we are better together when we do this. That's my 2 cents, and I guess that's going to move into the model coming up. Thank you much.
I definitely agree with the points that both of you brought up. And I also want to highlight something I think was maybe briefly touched on, but it's kind of the way in which the charity model can be employed in reverse. And I think with current political rhetoric and discourse, we're seeing this more and more. I'm sure everyone has heard different politicians admonishing handouts or criticizing people who rely on social welfare and social services as members of society who are leeching off the work of others, essentially. Um, and I would like to clarify that I do not ascribe to that belief at all, but I think it's important to acknowledge that people also can use um, this sort of mentality of uh, productivity or like contribution in a very negative way to justify uh, very dehumanizing and marginalizing behavior. Um, and then one other thing I wanted to quickly point out about the charity model is that it often comes up a lot in interpersonal relationships or interactions. I think for a lot of people, especially people who have invisible disabilities, the concept of self-disclosure becomes very daunting when you look at it through a lens of the charity model, because if you have a sort of disability that is not as easily perceived by others without actively sharing that, the option or like the choice to do so becomes scarier, I think, when you look at it from this idea that maybe once people know, they'll treat me differently. Once people know, I will not be seen the same way. So I just wanted to point that out as kind of another more individualized aspect of the charity model. But let's get into the human rights model. So as disability activism has continued to grow in a more global context, many disability advocates have pushed for a shift away from pity and charity towards something a bit more centralized and powerful, which is the recognition of disability as a matter of rights and justice, which is kind of the central focus of the human rights model. And so rather than seeing disabled people as patients or objects of charity, this framework centers disabled people as people with inherent rights who deserve equal participation in society. And it has been reflected in international agreements like the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is through the United Nations. And it has been powerful in shaping disability laws and policies by emphasizing dignity, autonomy, and access. However, legal rights don't automatically translate into real world change. And oftentimes, I think this can fall into the same trap as the social model, where the concept of human rights is very abstracted, and it doesn't necessarily stop the bad things that are happening. So I'll turn to our panelists again and see what they have to say about the human rights model.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you, Philip, for again, a great segue into this model. And I would say something that was coming up for me when you were speaking that I know you mentioned before is that idea of nothing about us without us, which is one of the fundamental flaws of a charity model, right? It's an outside force giving to those they perceive as needing instead of mutual aid. I think the human rights model is doing a lot of good. And the idea of basic human rights is always useful because it relies on that concept of mutuality and dignity as humans, a shared existence. And this, I think that it must exist with other models. So I see on the slide, right, it falls short because rights, legal rights don't materialize in people's minds immediately, right? Because rights exist doesn't mean that people are adhering to them or seeing people differently or treating people differently, but they are an important part of broader social change, right? They have to exist as well. So yeah, I would say what it does that the social model maybe doesn't do is focus much more on like change and kind of universal human rights for all people internationally and not so again in that way it is a little bit more not as much focused on changing society but on changing society yes but on changing kind of access to rights that that individuals have, right? So it is still focused on individuals in that way. Sometimes the social model can leave you feeling a little like nothing can change. But I think that the human rights model is doing good because it looks at multiple factors that influence our lives, including the environment and poverty, and how those intersect with disability, and infringe upon our basic human rights. But yeah, I agree with Sarah that the anything that is specifically about rights has the potential to be overturned at some point or, you know, and to not necessarily change frameworks within people's minds, but are still necessary. So I don't have a personal example about the human rights model, but that's what I would have to say about it.
Well, I'm grateful that I've had the experience of brushing up against lawyers, and I include lobbyists with law degrees in that, who are empathetic to the needs of the disabled community in this state anyway, as well as organizations like Disability Rights of Washington, who look for case precedents and an attempt to publish dynamic, strong precedent that can be drawn on, which builds human rights in the courts. That being said, I'm feeling apprehensive about our protections that in the last 10 years I thought were guaranteed by court precedents. I think the most familiar example for a lot of us is the 504 sit-in, a Section 504, an attempt to involve uh, access with any projects involving federal funding, and I know that wasn't entirely accurate, but bear with me. Um, I think that's a proof that we have to fight for our human rights. I have, at this point in my life, started to lean into what we need to do in more direct action ways to stand our ground and to peacefully assert that we're not going anywhere as a community. We want full integration. We expect that that is going to be where the pendulum of justice is going to swing. And we're going to, in my case, hand that off to another generation of disabled peers who are fighting for human rights. And it is a fight. It's a peaceful fight, but it's a fight. I'm happy that the UN declaration, the UN convention came about. I remember the year that it did, and some of my friends in community were signatories on that. It was very exciting. The respect that that gets is mostly that it's a historic document that, as long as it doesn't get burned, is going to be something that people can't ignore. They can pay selective attention to it, but it's still going to be out there. It's still going to be the standard of how we expect to be a part of the universal community on this planet. And I like to think of things internationally. I like to think that I have friends in Asia and Europe who are disabled, who are um, getting the opportunity to be a full part of their community. And that takes demands. We have in my office uh, a Frederick Douglass quote about that. And I do believe that we don't get our rights without demanding them. So again, I've at this point have concerns that we need to do, in addition to fighting in the courts, fighting for the attention of the greater community, and fight off the charity model and fight off the judgmental model that we've allowed to dominate the conversation. Thanks.
Great points being made. There's definitely a lot of limitations with this system, but I think a lot of hope and inspiration for the future as well. And this model very neatly links to our final model of this webinar, which is going to be the disability justice model. And so with this model, activists and scholars have built on the human rights framework while also attempting to expand it a bit, which has led to the development of this model, which looks a little bit more deeply about how disability intersects with other systems of power and oppression. And so disability justice emerged from activism led by disabled organizers with varying backgrounds and cultures and identities, Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer, and trans, groups like SINS and Valid help articulate this framework very neatly. But just disability justice really looks at how ableism intersects with other systems of oppression like racism, poverty, and colonialism, and emphasizes leadership by those most impacted, excuse me. It also strives to promote collective care and the idea that a person's worth should never be measured by productivity. And so rather than focusing only on access within existing systems, it calls for broader social transformation. So I'd love to invite our panelists to share their thoughts.
Sorry, I was still muted for a minute there. I'm quite fond of the disability justice model. I think that what it does for us is make visible ableism as another social force along the lines of racism, sexism. And I think it is something that we still, as Philip was saying, I do think this involves a fight, as does the human rights model, right? As we know, states are challenging 504 legislation. There's always a fight involved. But what the disability justice model gets right for me is that it is more holistic. So, and focuses on whole justice, not just rights, right? So, receiving a broader sort of social change than just guaranteed rights, though those are also necessary. And it also acknowledges the fact that we all have different positionalities, right? So that, you know, a Black woman with the same disabilities that I have may experience different forms of injustice related to that disability that is inflected by her race, right? And I think that that's a really important facet to understand, and to push back against a kind of universal experience, right? That actually we all face a variety of oppressions and discriminations that are not just linked to disability, but that can be compounded, right? I think that the disability justice model is more political than simply a social model. Political in the sense of like uh, when you think of environmental justice or racial justice, it's not just about rights, it's about changing society for the better. You can think, again, I think that goes back to universal design as well, right? That there's a difference between retrofitting places and mechanisms and actually thinking about a variety of body minds in the first place when you're building something. Disability justice would demand that we start thinking in that way always, right? And take into account race and sex and gender and sexuality and all other axes of oppression, right? So it acknowledges that you can't separate these things easily in an actual lived existence. You can't be sometimes disabled and sometimes a woman right? I have to think about both things all the time. Um, so yeah, I think that this is the most progressive model. Um, yeah, I think that um, it can feel overwhelming because it's such a big model, justice, right? And sometimes we have to focus on smaller changes because otherwise we would just be frustrated all of the time. The other thing that disability justice relies on is the idea of collective action, right? That this it's not just individuals, but collective action seeking justice. That I think is always more, um, yeah, produces better results than just individual fights. Um, and I'm going to sign off there with that one, or not sign off, but let go of that one.
I'm going to keep in mind we have 13 minutes by my clock, and I don't want to monopolize. As an older white male, I know it is my responsibility to make space for the ideas and the communication of, in priority, people who identify as women, who are persons of color, and exhaust that pool of interested folks in any project situation before I take on any part of something that's not behind the scenes. Um, Intersectionality or the attempt to uh, duck and cover from actively working in it is probably a hallmark of 2025 in my life. I was kind of disappointed when voices became somewhat muted, and I can't see it as anything but fear because there was a lot of momentum happening prior to about 15 months ago. And I want to see us return to intersectionality as a norm. The folks who should be leading our disability justice movement should be the folks who have had the least access to resources, to recognition, and that means disabled people of color. We have a lot of work to do. We have work to do in um, continuing to diversify culturally our movement, people who are taking specialty roles. Uh, I I focus in terms of business on people that I can access, the small business people. I fear that large global multi-billion dollar energies can bury us at least as much as provide us a large chunk of energy to move forward with our message. And I think we always need to keep an eye on that. I'm really not uh, happy with the direction that we're going right now as a broad community compared to 2 years ago. Uh, for me, again, doing more logistical support work and not being the person in front of a microphone that I used to be is important. Keeping a regular weekly mutual aid organization running, making sure that volunteers are welcome with my older adult peers, and being willing to share how that works with other people who might want to try mutual aid, and the idea that we develop ourselves individually, but when we take our talents and organize them in more community model, we get so much more done. And the biggest thing that we get done is the feeling that we're not doing this alone anymore. That makes for disability pride, and that for me makes a movement. Thank you.
I appreciate both our panelists so much for sharing their thoughts on all these models. Um, One thing I would like to add before we move on to our Q&A section is that these are 6 models. They are subjective, they are not comprehensive. There are more models out there. So if anyone in our audience is interested in looking into other ways of conceptualizing disability, or even just want to learn more about the models we've been talking about, I would highly recommend just doing a little research and seeing the different types of models there are. I could not tell you off the top of my head how many there are, but there are many, and they can be as broad and all-encompassing as the medical and social model, or as finite as, looking specifically at human rights. So highly recommend looking into that. And so now we'll shift into also really quickly, I'll just put this up on the screen. This is a list of the references. The information on the slides that I compiled was mainly gathered from these sources. So if you have any interest in looking into these topics further, these are some great links to start with. Leave that up for a second. Okay. And so now we'll go to our Q&A. So anyone in our audience is invited to submit questions they may have using the Zoom Q&A feature. And for those unfamiliar with this, you can find the Q&A tab by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. It should say Q&A with a little question mark in a speech bubble. So you can type your question there and press send. And questions will be visible to everyone on the webinar. I can read the questions aloud to our panelists, and our panelists are welcome to respond to any question. You don't need to respond in the same order as earlier. Just feel free to jump in whenever you like. We'll take as many questions as time allows. And so I'm thinking we probably have time for 2 or so questions. So I'll give our audience a minute or 2 to type some responses. So as people are maybe thinking of questions, I will ask one of our panelists myself. And so to Philip and Lydia, I want to ask if people are interested in learning more about models, where do you think would be a good place to start?
I think it's a variation on ask an autistic. Ask someone with lived experience who has put some time in to awareness of how their disability is affecting their inclusion in the community and doing some work to help themselves become more integrated. Um, Someone who has personal goals to hasten that integration is good. That's from my perspective in the independent living movement.
I'll just say I think there's so many resources. If you just start looking for models of disability, one resource that I would point out is Sins Invalid, SINS space INVALID They're an artistic group, but they are a group that is concerned with disability justice and is often considered to be the origin of that term. Um, but I think they have a resources page that is really quite awesome.
I just want to add a few authors, Marta Russell on capitalism and disability, um, the big, wide, beautiful world of autism. Steve Silberman is still a hero and not in an inspirational way for a lot of us.
Okay, hopefully not cutting us short, but I'm not seeing any questions pop up. And so with that, I would like to uh, invite anyone in our audience to please take this survey. We would really appreciate your feedback. Your input helps us measure and improve future webinars. I am also including a link to this in the chat as well. It should take less than 5 minutes to complete. So if you have capacity to do this today, I'd really appreciate it. And a quick reminder that today's session was recorded and will be uploaded to the Disability Empowerment Center's YouTube channel. So if you would like to revisit the conversation or share it with others, you'll be able to access it there in about a week or so. And I will paste the link to that in the chat as well. So the first link is for the survey, and then the second link is for the YouTube channel. And you can also see previous Understanding Ableism webinars we've done on that page as well. So thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for sharing your time, your expertise, and your insights. And thanks to all of you who joined us for this Understanding Ableism webinar. We hope you'll join us next month for our next webinar on April 21st, where we'll discuss emergency preparedness and disability. So thank you again for being a part of this conversation, and have a wonderful rest of your day.